The cruelest part, everybody loses. The cheater loses his throne, the mafia boss loses control, and the woman who wanted revenge ends up falling for the one man she was never supposed to touch. Sounds messy? It gets worse. Because just when the family explodes, the truth comes out, the bad brother gets exiled, and peace finally shows up. Boom. He comes back with allies, a plan, and her sister in his hands. This isn't just a love triangle, it's a checkmate where every move costs blood.
The infidelity acted as a catalyst, a single precipitating event poised to trigger a psychological schism far beyond Ettere's comprehension. His transgression was not singular but dual, involving two concurrent female subjects. The patient, however, exhibited no overt emotional outbursts or destructive behavior. Lena's response was a precise psychological strike directed at his brother, Rella Montealvo, the family's apex predator. Rella was an entity synonymous with terminal outcomes, an individual engaged only by the desperate, a category she now occupied. Her methodology was clinically direct, a single night of sexual engagement intended as a devastating blow to Ettoore's primary narcissistic vulnerability. Yet Rella's interaction was not that of a passive instrument. It was the assertion of dominance, confirming a terrifying diagnosis. The punitive action was never confined to one brother. She had entered the psychogeographical territory of Palermo's most dangerous individual. The true pathology, however, was the emergent, deep-seated compulsion to repeat the act. This is the patient's case file, and this is its inception. Chapter 1. The precipitating event. It commenced with an environmental anomaly, the apartment door ajar, a stark deviation from established patterns that signaled a critical threat. Ettoore's preoccupation with security was a known behavioral constant. This unsecured entry point presented as a symbolic invitation to witness his betrayal. She crossed the threshold. The auditory stimulus preceded the visual, a low-level luminescence from the bedroom before the tableau manifested like a silent, visceral trauma imprint. He was engaged with two other women, his consciousness disengaged from his surroundings, oblivious to her presence in the doorway, the keys representing their shared future inert in her hand. These were the same symbolic tokens he had presented as a contract for his monogamous attachment. For a duration of 3 seconds that registered as a temporal distortion, her cognitive functions failed to assimilate the visual data. The sound of an unknown female's laughter registered. An alien scent profile had contaminated the linens she had selected. At the center of this tableau was Ettoore, the facial structure that had served as the lure to extract her from her life in Naples to this foreign environment. No vocalization escaped her. She would not provide him the opportunity to pathologize her reaction as hysteria. She executed a controlled withdrawal, secured the door with practiced quiet, and vacated the premises as if she were a non-entity. Her early life trauma of being orphaned had conditioned one core behavioral response. The most potent form of distress is that which is suppressed, honed into a psychological weapon and deployed with lethal precision. She proceeded to her vehicle, located on a narrow Palermo street beneath the isolated illumination of an amber lamp, and entered the driver's seat. Her hands contracted around the steering mechanism, but the engine remained inactive. She stared into the void as a familiar somatic constriction affected her lungs and a burning sensation initiated behind her eyes. The onset of lacrimation would represent an uncontrollable emotional release. She suppressed the impulse, engaged the ignition, and drove away. At night, Palermo displayed an aesthetic quality that was almost hyper-real, too structured to be authentic. Historic structures and illuminated cathedrals created a stark contrast against the nocturnal backdrop as the marine air converged with the city's ambient temperature. Over the preceding 2 years, she had begun to psychologically acclimate to this location, a relocation undertaken solely for Ettore. This evening, however, each street felt like the remnant of a nullified existence. Her relocation to Palermo was his narcissistic trophy. Ettore Montecalvo, the idealized fiancé archetype, charismatic, aesthetically pleasing, and heir to a formidable Sicilian syndicate. And there was she, Hortensia Ferrante, an artisan from Naples with a background of socioeconomic disadvantage, primary caregiver to her sister, and with a pronounced aversion to organized crime, opulent residences, or men whose family names held more authority than the judiciary. Her parental units were terminated in a vehicular accident when she was just 19 years of age. In 24 hours, she transitioned into the role of protector for Fiammetta, who was 12 and retained a naive worldview. Lena possessed no such cognitive biases but shielded this innocence in her sibling. She maintained 3 separate jobs, with her aptitude for jewelry fabrication being the primary source of income. Then Ettore appeared, his persistence and charm augmented by a smile that projected a sense of sanctuary. She elected to invest her trust in him. She departed Naples, placing Fiammetta in the ambivalent custody of an aunt, to construct a future in Palermo, with the man now occupying their bed with other women. She halted the car at a scenic viewpoint, a location typically populated by tourists documenting the harbor during daylight hours. At this late hour, the observation point was devoid of human presence, and the city's illumination grid below her was merely an abstract pattern in the darkness. She retrieved her phone and initiated a call to the one individual who would predictably respond. Fiammetta's fatigued voice registered after the 4th ring. "Ort, it is 2 a.m. Who has expired?" Ettore engaged in infidelity, Lena reported, her vocal affect as flat and objective as a news dispatch. 5 seconds of complete auditory silence elapsed. "Clarify," Fiammetta stated, and Lena could detect the sound of bedsheets indicating a change in posture. "With whom?" 2 women. Another pause, of a shorter duration. "He was copulating with 2 of them." Her sister's voice fractured, not with hostility, but with the type of incredulity that Fiammetta consistently transmuted into dark humor. "The subject cannot even execute an affair competently. 1 makes you a cliché, 2 makes you a failure." The corner of Lena's mouth elevated fractionally. This was characteristic of Fiammetta. She could deploy such a statement amid a crisis and momentarily reduce its psychological scale. The therapeutic value was not in the humor itself, but in the resilient attachment it represented. She had confirmed her support system. "You need to self-extract. Return to Naples, board the first available train." "I am remaining," Lena stated, her gaze fixed on the harbor lights far below. "What is the rationale?" Lena did not respond, not from a lack of reasoning, but because her retributive strategy was crystallizing and required cognitive silence to fully form. Fiammetta understood without explicit data. Her sign-off was laden with subtext as she terminated the call. Lena remained stationary, the phone resting on her thigh as the Palermo wind permeated the vehicle, carrying the scent of the ocean and an unfamiliar emotional state. It was not grief or rage. It was a colder, more analytical impulse, a core component of her personality she had held in long-term suppression. That evening, Ettore Montecalvo fragmented her reality, and she resolved that he would remit payment in a currency he could not conceive. Chapter 2. The brother. She maintained verbal silence for 2 days. When Ettore called the following day, his behavior was consistent with baseline normalcy. He referenced a luncheon, complained about a meeting with their financial manager, and concluded with a rote, "I love you." The word sounded like another task on his daily schedule. She confirmed she was well and reciprocated the statement. Upon disconnecting, her stomach was a locus of cold tension, but her hands remained stable. This was not performance, it was tactical. The retributive ideation developing within her was not a chaotic, destructive force. This was a form of vengeance that necessitated stealth, precision, and a target selected to inflict maximum psychological damage. The target subject was already identified. The methodology of approach was the only remaining variable. On the second evening, an optimal opportunity materialized. The routine family dinner at the Villa Montecalvo. Once a month, the matriarch convened her sons, the syndicate's key personnel, and any other individuals requiring a reinforcement of their hierarchical position. As Ettere's fiancé, her attendance was mandatory. She selected a black dress with a high neckline, secured her hair, and applied a dark pigment to her lips. The reflection that met her in the glass provided a moment of acute insight. For the first time in 2 years, she was not attired for observation. She was attired for psychological warfare. The Villa Montecalvo was situated on a hill on Palermo's periphery, affording a view of the city and the sea. It was an old estate, enclosed by massive stone walls, concealed gardens, and a corroding iron gate that served as the portal to an alternate reality. The car's tires moved over the gravel drive and halted as 2 guards opened their doors without speaking. As she exited, he placed a hand on her waist with the unthinking entitlement of one who equates a ring with ownership. The dining hall was vast, dominated by a long, dark table with capacity for 15 individuals, all situated beneath the umbra of a massive iron chandelier. Upon their arrival, nearly every seat was occupied. Attendants moved through the space, refilling glasses engraved with the family crest. At the head of the table sat Donna Lucaya Montecalvo, the 58-year-old matriarch of the family. Her gray hair was arranged in a severe bun. Gold chains adorned her neck, and she exuded an aura of absolute authority. As the mother of Ettore and Rella, she governed the domestic sphere with a power her sons would not challenge. She acknowledged Lena with a nod and a neutral expression, the most positive reception she had ever received. To Donna Lucaya, Lena would perpetually be the non-entity from Naples, an intrusive presence at her sacred table. The subjects are now in position. Hortensia is seated adjacent to Itora, who is engaged in a discussion regarding shipping logistics with a subordinate. Opposite them is Saro Ferrante, the family's advisor, no biological relation despite the surname, his fatigued eyes scanning the environment. Saro is 60 and bald and maintains a polite but detached demeanor with all subjects. Leaning against a nearby wall is Bastiano, Rella's primary enforcer and intimidating presence. In his early 30s and with a hyper-muscular build, his quietude is difficult to interpret, a fusion of ennui and a predator's vigilance. Bastiano has shadowed Rella since adolescence, their bond deeper than any formal allegiance. During the dessert course, a notable deviation from social protocol is observed. The subject, Ettore, engages a mobile phone at the table. Donna Lucrezia exhibits a non-verbal display of acute hostility, her lips thinning due to vasoconstriction, though the stimulus of her anger remains entirely unnoticed. The communication is brief, under 60 seconds, but 2 keywords, transfer and postponed, introduce a new stressor. Upon disconnection, Saro assesses the situation with clinical detachment, stating, a problem with the doc accounts, Ettore? Ettore deploys a characteristic defense mechanism, a placating smile, to nullify the concern, to which Saro remarks, "It is nothing a competent bookkeeper cannot resolve." The man, a case study in controlled composure, elevated his glass. Yet a momentary stress response was visible as his knuckles whitened. The associate, Bastiano, feigned indifference, his gaze shifting to Rella with a signal I would only decode later, the pregnant silence of an operative about to act. My focus then fixed upon him. Rella Montecalvo, positioned at the head of the table. Previous encounters had registered his presence, but not his psychological weight. I had failed to perceive the immense pressure he contained, a core of structural steel, and hands that rested on the table with gravitational force. For 6 years since the death of his father, Don Salvatore, Rella had exerted absolute control over the Montecalvo clan. He assumed command at 26, a leader defined by verbal economy and zero tolerance for error. He lacked Ettore's socially appealing phenotype, the sharp jawline, pale eyes, and disarming smile. Rella's physiognomy, by contrast, induced quiet compliance in pathologically violent men. His features were severe, his jaw rigid, his dark eyes seemingly absorbing all data from his surroundings. This evening, however, marked a behavioral anomaly. This evening, his clinical gaze was fixed, unwavering upon me during dessert, as Donna Lucrezia discussed renovations while her capos registered silent financial protest. While Ettore responded to some trivial humor, I traced patterns in my wine, becoming aware of a persistent, focused observation. Lifting my head, my eyes met Rella's. The intensity of his focus induced a somatic response in me, a feeling of constriction at the throat. He maintained the gaze for approximately 2 to 3 seconds past the point of social convention before averting his eyes, a classic power display. But the action was logged, and a cold hypothesis formed. This was not an initial assessment. Rella Montecalvo had subjected me to this level of scrutiny before, during other functions, when my focus was on performing the role of Ettore's fiancé. Over the meal, Donna Lucrezia's vocal tone, superficially warm, carried a sharp, condescending edge. "Hortensia, my dear, how is that little jewelry hobby of yours?" Ettore added, "You are creating such beautiful things, it is good to have a pastime." The descriptor, hobby, registered as a significant narcissistic injury. 2 years of my work, a Palermo exhibit, and 3 foreign commissions were dismissed as a trifle. As I prepared a response, Ettore interceded. "Mother, Hortensia is gifted. Her work sells." He delivered the words with the flat effect of a man merely closing an uncomfortable conversational loop. I produced a smile and a quiet thank you, using wine to self-medicate. After dinner, the males adjourned to the study, the females to the parlor. Feeling no affiliation with either faction, I moved to the corridor linking the dining area and gardens. The space was a stone passage displaying portraits of ancestors in ostentatious gold frames. The ambient temperature was low, the silence heavy and oppressive. It was here I encountered Rella. He was exiting the study unaccompanied. No Bastiano, no Saro, no security detail. He registered my presence and ceased all forward movement. He made no gesture to yield, pass, or acknowledge. He simply stopped, his eyes on me, and waited. The hall was wide enough for 2, yet we both occupied the central path. Suddenly, the proximity between us felt clinically significant. "You are not with the others," he observed. His voice was of a lower, more resonant frequency than I recalled. It was a statement, not an inquiry, the conversational pattern of a man accustomed to issuing directives. I am not like the others, I responded, the words emerging without conscious filter. For an instant, I registered this as a tactical misstep, but Rella's expression remained unreadable. Then the corner of his mouth shifted upward by perhaps a single millimeter. It was a micro-expression, brief and subtle, but in that small change, I observed what seemed incongruous for his personality type. Surprise. He had anticipated compliance and received a counter-stimulus. Interesting. It was his only comment. He moved past, his scent lingering for 5 seconds, an earthy, severe fragrance, a chemical signature of his persona. I remained stationary, my heart rate elevated, as a conclusion crystallized with the finality of a diagnosis. Rella Montecalvo, Ettere's brother, the unopposed and feared Don, had offered me a vestigial smile in an unobserved corridor. The return journey was characterized by my total silence. Ettore opened my door, kissed my forehead, and remarked on the pleasantness of the evening. I concurred, my gaze fixed on the rearview mirror as the Montecalvo compound receded into darkness. Rella Montecalvo presented as the perfect instrument for my planned retaliation. A vector of attack Ettore would be psychologically incapable of predicting. The most alarming variable was not the plan itself, but the chilling velocity with which it was formulated, suggesting it had existed in a latent state, awaiting a catalyst. Chapter 3. Utilizing a similar pathology to combat the source. Within 1 week, I understood Rella's patterns better than he did. Ettore provided the data, frequently complaining of his brother's work schedule, private meetings, and autocratic control. He is dining at Ferraro's again, Ettore would state, as if the venue were a personal affront. He dedicates more time there than to the estate. I cataloged each piece of data, a jeweler processing raw materials for a weapon. Ristorante Ferraro was located on a narrow street in Palermo's old quarter, a lane ill-suited for vehicles, but perpetually monitored by a black car with tinted windows. The establishment's exterior was deliberately nondescript. Inside, the environment was defined by dark wood, low illumination, and a palpable tension indicative of high-stakes transactions. I arrived on a Tuesday alone, having told Ettore I was meeting a gallery associate. He did not request a name. I positioned myself at the bar, ordered a red wine, and monitored the entrance with disciplined patience. Rella entered at 9:15. I registered his arrival instantly. The door opened for him, with Bastiano following 2 paces behind. As predicted, their entry altered the room's entire social dynamic. The manager's posture became rigid. A server materialized. 2 men near the entrance subtly adjusted their stances. Rella wore a dark suit, no tie, collar open. He moved with the quiet authority of an individual who holds psychological ownership of every other person present. His eyes made contact with mine from the entrance. Diverging from his expected path, he issued a quiet directive to Bastiano. Bastiano's gaze shifted from me to his principal before he proceeded to their table alone. Rella approached the bar and occupied the adjacent stool. He maintained a precise spatial distance, too deliberate for a chance encounter, but too great for a social overture. "You again," he said, his gaze averted. He signaled the bartender, who produced a whiskey without being asked. His patterns were clearly established here. "Me again," I confirmed, agitating the wine in my glass. "Alone." "So it would appear." He consumed the drink, his eyes studying the bottles as if decrypting a code. He then turned, his expression clinically serious. His focus was sharp, analytical, as if attempting to excavate a concealed psychological truth. "My brothers intended," he stated, is seldom observed in locations not of her own choosing. The statement was not an observation, but a direct challenge. Perhaps her list of approved locations has been revised, I countered, maintaining eye contact. A small muscle spasmed near his mouth, a physiological tell that my response had registered. He finished his glass in one motion, set it down, and stood. Good night, Hortensia. His pronunciation of my name assigned a distinct, heavy weight to each syllable. He moved to his table in the shadows where Bastiano stood waiting, arms crossed, his expression one I could not then analyze. It was the look of a subordinate who has observed a breach in protocol and has elected to withhold comment. As Rella took his seat, Bastiano's arms lowered, his gaze moving to the bar, to me, then back to Rella. Without looking up from the menu, Rella instructed, "Sit, Bastiano." For 2 seconds, Bastiano remained motionless, as if weighing insubordination, before he replied, "I believe I will remain standing. The vantage point is superior from here." Rella did not respond, but from across the room I saw it again. That slight curvature of the lips, this time approximating a genuine smile. 4 days later, the next interaction occurs, but the subject is no longer the initiating agent. She is at a small gallery event in Palermo, observing patrons assess 3 of her sculptures. The bell over the entrance sounds, and Rela Montecalvo enters. He moves with a calm sense of ownership, as if the street itself were his domain. He is unaccompanied. No security, no entourage. He wears a dark shirt, sleeves rolled, and the atmosphere in the small space immediately intensifies, consistent with previous encounters. The subject's autonomic response is palpable, a tension she attempts to suppress with a veneer of control. "I wasn't anticipating your arrival," she states, a verbal shield against her escalating heart rate. He is positioned before her work. "The invitation was at the residence," he replies. "E.T. left it. I surmised the exhibition might be of interest." The subtext is a calculated dismissal, a message she decodes with precision. His gaze then intensifies, shifting from cursory observation to a genuine analysis of her creations. His focus settles on a silver bracelet with blood-red coral, an object of significant emotional value to her. He then delivers an assessment that destabilizes her psychological composure. The coral is not an embellishment, it is the foundation. A cognitive shock reverberates through her. Critics, specialists, none had perceived this. Yet this apex predator, this capo, was reflecting the core thesis of her craft back at her. All she can articulate is, "You have a strong design sensibility. I recognize things created with intent," he parries. They lean over the glass, the interstitial space humming with unspoken energy. His hand moves toward the bracelet, his fingers making contact with hers for a suspended 3 seconds. Neither subject withdraws. The current holds them until he lifts the item, inspects it, then replaces it, pointedly nullifying the charge that had just passed between their hands. "Commendable work, Hortensia," is his only comment before turning and departing without a secondary glance. The somatic memory of his touch leaves her disoriented. Her schema for retribution is now a treacherous, unreadable territory. Their third encounter is the breaking point. It happens late one night in the villa's garden after another hollow familial meal. She had retreated there for emotional regulation, away from Donna Lucrezia's suffocating theatrics. The garden is a walled secret, heavy with the aroma of oranges, a stone bench at its center. And on that bench, absorbed in thought, sits Rel. He registers her arrival not with a startled response, but with a slight nod, as if her presence was an expected variable. Fleeing the event, she asks, her steps deliberate as she closes the space. Fleeing my mother, he revises, which in this house is functionally identical. An authentic laugh escapes her, startling them both. She sits beside him, a deliberate and bold breach of his personal space. A quiet interval settles between them. Do you find this life acceptable? He asks. Palermo. The question is deceptively simple, but it contains the weight of a clinical evaluation. Portions of it, she concedes. But my identity is smaller here. In Naples, I had status. Here, I am just the new woman. He becomes unnervingly still, her words having activated a deep-seated schema within him. He offers a fragment of his own case history. I took command of the family at 26, he says. My father died, and the next day, 30 men awaited my directives. Nobody inquired if I was prepared. They were simply waiting. With that single self-disclosure, she perceives the man beneath the pathology, not the capo, but a solitary king of a kingdom he never chose. Do you miss it? She asks, her voice soft. Who you were previously? A long silence hangs in the air before he whispers, I don't remember him. The words strike her with the force of a shared diagnosis. She understands completely. She cannot recall her own identity before her parents' deaths, before the burden of raising Fiamma. In this mutual psychological void, the strategic game between them dissolves. This is no longer tactical, it is limbic and real. He turns to her, eliminating the last inch of air separating them. She senses his body heat, breathes his scent, hears the quiet cadence of his self-control. He leans in, the motion slow, deliberate, a man with full cognitive awareness, the boundary he is about to violate. This is a hazardous game you are playing, Hortensia, he murmurs, his breath a warm stimulus on her cheek. Perhaps, she breathes back, her eyes locked on his, but I am not the one losing emotional regulation. The challenge is made. His eyes drop to her mouth, then return to hers, a war raging within him, and then Rel stops. He knows that to bridge this gap with his family 30 meters away would incinerate his entire world. He stands, adjusts his collar, and offers a quiet good night. And he is gone. She remains frozen on the bench, her pulse a frantic arrhythmia, trying to reconstruct the cognitive distortion that this is her revenge, that she is in control. The next morning, she gives Fameta the redacted version. So let me be clear, Fameta says, you have switched your objective from the unfaithful brother to the Mafia kingpin brother. The subject, Hortensia, assesses her own strategy with clinical detachment, labeling it a dramatized fiction. An uncharacteristic laugh escapes her, a sound so alien it provokes a startled response. Later, an attempt to sketch jewelry fails. The graphite deviates from conscious command. Repetitive erasure reveals the true focus of her subconscious. She is rendering the male target's jawline a profile retained with pathological precision. Her motor control fails as the pencil drops. The subject fixates on the sketch, experiencing acute cardiac distress as the mission's directive dissolves. Her objective was to manipulate Rel to inflict emotional trauma on Etro. Enjoying the deception was not a parameter. The target has now become a persistent cognitive intrusion. His voice, I see things made with purpose, is reinterpreted as a validation of her being, not her work. Visual stimuli now trigger haptic memories of his contact. The target has saturated her psyche. Every memory and sensation is now linked to him. So when Etre phones that night to coordinate a 2-day trip to Catania for a supplier meeting, his voice is exactly what it has always been. Carelessly oblivious, the voice of a man unaware his life is balanced on a knife's edge. She waits for the conditioned response of rage, for the sting of betrayal that was her only motivation. She braces for the psychological impact, but what comes is a cold void, something worse than hate, complete indifference. Etre Montecalvo is speaking, and she feels nothing. No fury, no pain, no drive for vengeance. He had become background noise, a television left on in a vacant room. And if he was static, so was her revenge. Vengeance requires an emotional catalyst, and hers had been extinguished by something else, something captured in that drawing. It was in the phantom sensation of warmth from the garden, in the memory of a burdened man admitting he had lost his identity. She crushed the sketch of Rel's jaw, threw it away, and repeated the lie. This is still about retribution. I am in control. The plan is unchanged. It was a fiction she was too afraid to dismantle. Across the city, Etre was beginning to notice behavioral anomalies. A text that was too short, a look he could not interpret, the way she concealed her phone when he entered a room. He had not yet synthesized the data, but he was observing, and she could feel her window of opportunity closing. Chapter 4: The Night of Destabilization. 2 weeks after they first met, she made the call from which there could be no retreat. It was not impulse. For 14 days, a psychic war had consumed her. Logic against instinct. Her mind told her, Rallo Montecalvo is a means, not the end. But her emotional core told a different story. And that story was disrupting her sleep, making her recall his touch in the gallery when she should have been planning his family's ruin. It had her experiencing olfactory hallucinations of orange blossoms while lying in her own bed. She labeled it adrenaline, the thrill of the manipulation, the high of her own cleverness. She swore that once her vengeance was executed, these symptoms would subside. But the night she started her car and drove toward the Villa Montecalvo without informing anyone, she knew the phase of self-deception was over. She reached the estate near 2300 hours. The main gates were secured, but a single light burned in an upstairs window, Rel's study, his nocturnal domain. She parked on the street, got out, and walked the guard at the side gate. He recognized her face, the fiancé, and gave her that careful mixture of confusion and deference the staff reserved for anyone branded Montecalvo. I need to see Rel, she told him. The use of his first name, a deliberate power play. Not Mr. Montecalvo, not the boss. The guard registered the status shift immediately, but was disciplined enough to say nothing. He spoke into his radio, received a reply, and opened the gate without another word. The villa felt different in the dark. The corridors, usually filled with activity, were now shadowed and silent, broken by pools of light on the marble. With every footstep's echo, she knew she was walking toward an irreversible outcome. At the second floor's far end was Rel's study. Behind a heavy door she had never passed through. Reaching it, she saw it was ajar, a sliver of light bisecting the hall. She nudged it open and went inside. He was at his desk in a dark, rolled-sleeve shirt, flanked by columns of paper. The room was the man himself. Shadowed wood walls, shelves crammed with books, a worn leather chair, and the rich scent of timber and coffee. The open window allowed in a night breeze tasting of the sea and nearby orange blossoms. The moment I entered, Rel's gaze captured mine, transforming the silence into a psychological tool. He evaluated me with that familiar, analytical precision of a man planning a strategic move. I stood immobile in a plain dark dress, my hair unbound, the frantic rhythm in my chest a physiological signal I was certain he could read. "Hortensia," he said, and my name spoken at 11 at night in his private study as the door latched felt like a territorial declaration. "I had to see you," I ventured, taking a single step. The desk was a physical barrier between us, but it felt psychologically meaningless. "This late," he stated, a fact, not a question. He rounded the desk with a slow, predatory grace, not walking so much as repositioning himself for a decisive action. With each step, his approach seemed to alter the room's atmosphere, the ambient temperature rising as he reduced the distance. He halted less than a foot away, compelling an upward tilt of her head to meet his gaze. In this isolated context, absent the garden, guests, or feigned coincidence, his presence carried a different psychological weight. It was concentrated, infinitely more menacing. "You did not come for me," he stated, his voice a low frequency with a dangerous undertone previously undetected. "You are here because of him." The assertion struck with the impact of clinical fact, not for its inaccuracy, but for its precise diagnosis of her mission's core objective. She had arrived to procure a weapon. She was present to convert Rel into the very mechanism of Etra's ruin. He perceived the entirety of her design. His insight had been a silent observer of her whole strategy. Her lips parted to form a rebuttal, any maneuver to reclaim the illusion of control, but he offered no opportunity. "It makes no difference to me," he declared before his mouth met hers. The kiss was initiated before his words fully registered. This was not an inquiry. It was a deliberate, calculated action, its pressure exact and assured, as if rehearsed mentally 1,000 times. His hands framed her face in a grip that was not painful, merely non-negotiable. She could register his warmth, the taste of whiskey, and the lingering scent of wood smoke. But at this proximity, it was something more primal. It was a specific heat, a unique pressure that was his alone. This presented an opportunity for disengagement. The logical response was to push him away, adjust her dress, and deliver a sharp remark on his audacity. Yet the kiss short-circuited her cognitive processes. Her body reacted long before her mind could formulate a protest. Her hands, acting autonomously, gripped his shirt, registering the coarse textile and the solid muscle beneath as his fingers traced a line from her face to her throat, pausing in the hollow with a purpose that induced breathlessness. The subsequent events were never part of her operational plan. Nothing that evening was. She knew Rel was a man who navigated the world with the precision of a blade. He commanded men with a word and confronted foes with a stare colder than any ordinance. But here, isolated in the sleeping villa, he presented as a different force entirely. Every contact was methodical, as though he had anticipated this specific moment and would not squander it. His hands moved over her with a deliberation she had never experienced from handsome, charming men, for whom physical contact was another form of negotiation. Rella was unhurried. He maintained eye contact with each new touch, soliciting consent non-verbally, providing every chance to retreat while projecting the certainty that she would not. His fingers eased the strap of her dress from her shoulder with an almost agonizing slowness. As the silk glided across her skin, she observed his jaw clench, a micro-expression revealing the immense control it was costing him. At some stage, her back made contact with the cool wood of his desk, a severe sensory contrast to the heat radiating from his skin. A gasp was expelled from her throat, and he paused, not at her behest, but to analyze the vocalization, to understand it. His dark, intense eyes fixed on hers, and within them she perceived something more terrifying than any physical touch. This was not seduction. This was a primal, absolute compulsion. She tore at his shirt. The buttons yielded, the fabric parted. The instant her hands made contact with his skin, hot, taut, and traced with the pale lines of old scars, his respiration faltered. It devolved into a fractured, desperate sound. This was the first observable fissure in the legendary composure of Rella Montecalvo. He lifted her by the waist, placing her on the desk's edge with a startling effortlessness that suspended her breathing. He positioned himself between her legs, his hands securing her hips, and pressed his forehead to hers. For a protracted moment, they remained in that state, sharing the charged atmosphere, poised at the threshold of the irreversible. As their final garments were shed, his expression was not of lust, but of pure volition, the look of a man in total command who required her to acknowledge it. He entered her with a slow, decisive push. The sensation caused her to arch back, her nails pressing into his shoulders. He held still, his breath hitched, his eyes locked on hers. In that instant, she observed it, a fracture in his self-control. This was an exchange of submission as much as of dominance. The cadence he established was a study in absolute regulation, a slow, profound rhythm, withdrawing to the brink of separation before repossessing her. He assessed her every tremor, his hands anchoring her hips to his body. The desk groaned under their weight, a raw percussion against the sound of their labored breaths and her name, a faint whisper against the pulse in her throat. The tension escalated until it broke. He moved faster, deeper, and her reality compressed to the singular point of his presence. She fractured first, a tremor seizing her frame as she could only hold on. Rella followed an instant later, his own body tensing in a final, potent surge. A guttural sound was expelled from him against her skin, an admission he made no attempt to suppress. For the first time, the man's perfect self-possession had completely shattered. Afterward, a silence descended upon the study, heavier and more profound than any she had ever experienced. An unknown period of time elapsed. He remained braced over the desk, his shirt undone, his hair disheveled. She stood near the window, her hands trembling as she adjusted her dress, the air thick with the scent of the sea, the night, and something far more fundamental. It was Rella who broke the stillness. "This was never part of your plan," he observed, his gaze fixed on a distant point. His voice was rougher, possessing a new quality she could not identify. It was not cold or regulated. It was simply brutally objective. And no, it had not been part of her plan either. She did not reply. No response was necessary. His assessment was entirely correct. She had entered this house to turn brother against brother. The recent events in his study had incinerated that protocol. The fire, the intensity, the way he felt like a lost component of her own psyche, that was not related to revenge. It was a terror far greater than the betrayal that had motivated her. She fled the villa before sunrise. The massive iron gate groaned open, the sound echoing across the hills like a final, futile warning. She collapsed into her car, her hands clenching the wheel as she stared into the darkness, attempting to process the night's fallout. She retrieved her phone, messaging Fia. "I have to talk to you." A reply appeared in under 30 seconds, despite it being nearly 3 in the morning. If you are confessing to murder, I am on the first train to Palermo. If not, it can wait. I have an 8 o'clock exam." A small smile formed on her lips. She lowered the phone, started the engine, and drove down the hill. Palermo was displayed below, a luminous grid of everything she had just fractured. What she could not have known was that another individual in the villa was also awake, and that in 3 days the House of Monte Calvo was about to receive all the data. Chapter 5. Blood and Silence. 72 hours. That was the interval required for her entire life to collapse. For 3 days, she existed in a state of high tension. She woke with Atra, consumed coffee with him, and responded to his messages as if no anomaly had occurred, while the psychological weight of her betrayal manifested as a constant physical ache. Her body retained a memory her voice could not articulate. Her fingers could still trace the texture of Rella's shirt. Her skin recalled his warmth, his presence, and the scent of salt and timber that persisted long after she departed the villa. She sent no communication to Rella. He sent none to her. The subsequent vacuum, which should have offered relief, instead became a suffocating anxiety from which she could not escape. On the 3rd day, a family lunch was called by Donna Lucrezia at the villa. It was presented as a casual gathering with the table set on the garden terrace, its white linen a stark contrast under the intense Palermo sun. She arrived on E.T.'s arm, as protocol dictated, wearing a suitable dress and a carefully applied smile. Bastiano maintained a post by the rear gate, arms crossed. Sardo, the family's counsel, was focused on his phone. Donna Lucrezia managed the staff with the authority of a military commander. Rella had not yet appeared, and she detested the involuntary way her eyes surveyed the grounds for him. The meal commenced in his absence. Ettore was loud, his laughter pronounced as he refilled his wine with unwavering focus. Donna Lucrezia issued a series of critiques regarding the food, the renovations, and the oppressive climate. Everything felt standard, deceptively stable. Rella materialized as the second course was served. He approached from the garden path, attired in his customary dark clothing, his expression that of a man burdened by significant responsibilities. He occupied the vacant chair at the table's far end, gave his mother a curt nod, and then deliberately removed her from his field of vision. The precarious equilibrium on the terrace disintegrated the moment he arrived. The tension originated not from his behavior, but from her strenuous performance of innocence against the secret they shared. In that strained silence, Etra's movement was less a rise and more an eruption. He launched from his chair, adopting an accuser's posture with his glass held aloft. His eyes were not intoxicated, but lit with a cold, lucid fury. His question, "Can someone please explain what the hell is happening?" was a projectile aimed directly at her and Rella. The incisive query severed the ambient conversation, producing a deep, chilling silence. Donna Lucrezia became a frozen tableau, her fork suspended in mid-air. A cascade of nonverbal cues signaled the shift. Sardo's device was lowered. Bastiano's posture relaxed. The group's focus moved in a predictable, synchronized arc from eater to the subject, witnessing the unfolding psychological collapse. Donna Lucrezia initiated a de-escalation protocol, stating, "Eater." "No, mother," he responded, exhibiting classic oppositional defiance. His focus remained locked on the girl, a clear display of targeted aggression. She exhibits full awareness of the situation, as does he. The subject's hands gripped her glass, a self-soothing gesture for stabilization. She presented with tachycardia, yet her motor control remained steady, a paradox in acute stress. Despite 3 days of cognitive rehearsal, the reality of the collective judgment from the Monte Calvo family unit induced a state of perceived persecution. "You," the aggressor vocalized, using the glass as a symbolic weapon, the liquid swirling. "You were with my brother." This verbalization acted as the catalyst for environmental disruption. Donna Lucrezia exhibited an involuntary startle response, dropping her utensil. Sardo's stoic facade displayed a micro-expression of surprise, a singular brow twitch. Ancillary staff demonstrated conditioned avoidance, vacating the area. The subject established direct eye contact with Eder, a recontextualization of a former emotional bond. Then, displaying unexpected resilience, she initiated a counter-response. The instant of that disclosure, you precipitated the collapse. Do not project blame onto my subsequent survival strategy. A 2-second cognitive pause followed. During this interval, Eder's narcissistic rage deflated into shock, then curdled into profound humiliation. The subject's statement was not supplication, but a calculated counteroffensive, exposing his infidelity to the family unit. His attempt at a retaliatory slur, "You're a," was preempted by Rahl's physical action. The auditory stimulus of his chair, scraping stone, effectively terminated Eder's vocalization. Rahl's mere physical presence rendered displays of overt aggression primitive. His posture, a rigid dorsal line and unwavering gaze, transformed the ambient silence into a tool of psychological pressure. "Sit down," Rahl commanded his brother, the vocalization low and laden with latent threat. Eder maintained his posture in defiance, yet his verbal aggression ceased. He exhibited physiological signs of acute stress: tremors, facial flushing, and a fixated gaze of intense sibling animosity toward Rahl. At this point, Donna Lucrezia intervened, placing her napkin with deliberate finality. "Rahlello, the study, immediately." The imperative was an exercise of ultimate familial authority. Rahl's gaze made brief contact with mine, transmitting a significant volume of nonverbal information. The data conveyed anxiety, suppressed rage, and an implicit instruction for resilience. He complied with the matriarchal order. Eder remained on the terrace, his elevated arousal state evident in his grip on the glass. Bastiano then positioned himself as a physical interposition between the siblings, a transparent de-escalation maneuver. The subject withdrew from the immediate environment, seeking sensory refuge. She initiated a self-regulation technique, pressing her back to a cool surface and engaging in a deep, diaphragmatic breath to manage her stress response. Auditory stimuli followed, rapid footsteps and subdued vocalizations. Proximate to the staircase, Sardo and Bastiano engaged in a low-volume exchange. The subject remained motionless, eyes closed, processing the incoming information. "The most recent consignment data shows a discrepancy," Sardo stated, his tone effectively neutral. "This pattern has been consistent for months. He is misappropriating funds from a minimum of 3 units, possibly more." A 2-second pause from Bastiano. "Lower your volume. Is Rahl aware?" "Rahl's awareness is total," Sardo confirmed. "He is merely awaiting the optimal strategic moment." The sounds receded. The subject remained stationary, assimilating this new intelligence into an emerging and increasingly threatening situational schema. The subject remained in her concealed position at Villa Monte Calvo as Donna Lucrezia's voice penetrated the study door. The matriarch's words constituted a clear ultimatum. "You will remove that woman, or I will initiate a family vote," she stated, her vocal tone devoid of warmth. the outcome of which is a foregone conclusion. No audible response from Raul was detected. Subsequently, the sound of a door cycling open and shut was noted. As the subject attempted to withdraw, Donna Lucrezia emerged, establishing immediate eye contact. The subject's clandestine observation was compromised before she could formulate a plausible alibi. The matriarch's expression indicated awareness of the subject's eavesdropping and, significantly, indifference to it, suggesting a possible intent for the conversation to be overheard. At close range, physiological markers previously masked were observable: periorbital retides, the dermal fragility of her neck, and signs of chronic fatigue associated with defending a system that afforded her no true agency. "Do you believe your case is unique?" she inquired, her tone historical rather than aggressive. "I once occupied your position. Salvatore brought me here at 23 to the same hostile reception from his mother that I now project onto you. Eventually, she expired, and I assimilated her role. This is the operational model of the household. The durable female figures inherit the physical space, but are perpetually denied executive authority." The subject met her gaze directly, stating, "By that logic, the operational model requires revision." For a duration of 3 seconds, Donna Lucrezia conducted a silent appraisal. A discernible shift occurred in her expression, not of acquiescence, but of recognition. It was an acknowledgement that the subject was not a replicable archetype, but a novel variable capable of disrupting the established equilibrium. She made no verbal comment, instead making brief contact with her necklace before proceeding on her path. The subject observed a minor instability in the matriarch's gait, indicating the conversation had a psychologically disruptive effect. For the subsequent 2 days, Raul practiced deliberate avoidance. He was physically present within the compound, but maintained zero contact, creating a relational void. The recent intimate encounter began to feel derealized. The subject perceived her role as diminished to that of a peripheral figure in the Monte Calvo dynamic. Eder had departed the morning after the confrontation and had not reappeared. From his urban residence, Eder engaged in a pattern of digital harassment, which the subject systematically ignored. Her psychological focus shifted from Eder to Raul, whose silence she identified as primary stressor. This silence induced a state of affective emptiness she attempted to self-diagnose. On the second evening, she contacted her support system, Fametta, who answered with an immediacy suggesting anticipation. The subject began her report, but Fametta interrupted, her tone exhibiting markers of extreme fear. "Stop," she pleaded. "Aurort, please stop. Your narrative is inducing a state of fear in me." The subject ceased speaking. "I am not exaggerating," Fametta continued with auditory evidence of pacing. "You are embedded within a crime syndicate while I am studying fine arts. My capacity to intervene is non-existent. It is impossible." Her delivery of the final word was vocally strained, a signifier of profound psychological pain. This interaction marked a reversal of their typical protector-protected dynamic, inducing a state of mutual helplessness. "Your assistance is to remain where you are," the subject instructed, affecting a confident tone, "and to trust my judgment." A 5-second silence ensued. Then, with reduced volume, "I do. But any harm to you will trigger a retributive action against their villa. I promise this." The subject's incipient smile was inhibited by pain, recognizing her motivation was no longer survival, but attachment to him. This realization manifested as a somatic shock. Her motivations had shifted from strategic to instinctual. It was a compulsion that defied logical assessment, a fixation on Raul Montalvo. The subject's desire encompassed his aggression and his perceived psychological fragmentation, symptoms consistent with traumatic bonding. His apparent choice of family over her registered as a more profound betrayal than Olive Eater's deceit. The next morning, a terse communication arrived from Bastiano. "Meeting Great Hall tonight." A subsequent line altered the dynamic. "He requests your attendance." The subject analyzed this phrasing 3 times. The verb request, as opposed to demands, carried a psychological potency that exceeded any physical intimacy. The subject could not ascertain his motive, which presented several conflicting hypotheses. Was this an act of claiming or discarding, of advocacy or appeasement? The only certainty was his requirement that she be present for the outcome. The subject had no intention of being absent. Chapter 6. What remains? The architecture of the Great Hall at Villa Monte Calvo seemed engineered for adjudications of this nature. Its high ceilings, stone surfaces, and throne-like chairs amplified the existing power dynamics. This was the locus of the family's foundational power and Rawls' subsequent usurpation. That evening, the environment was dimly lit and the ambient tension was physiologically palpable. Upon entering, the subject observed that the key figures were already positioned in a static arrangement. Donna Lucrezia was at the table's head, her clasped hands a physical manifestation of acute anxiety regarding an imminent threat. Sardo sat beside her, his expression exhibiting a characteristic emotional flatness, a portfolio on the table. Bastiano assumed his typical surveillance post by the wall, arms crossed, gaze focused. To the left sat 3 capos, and at the far end, Eater displayed an expression of self-satisfaction, his posture suggesting preparedness for conflict. The subject paused at the threshold, occupying a liminal state, not integrated into the group but not dismissed. Her presence was a direct result of Rawls' summons. He was the final arrival, securing the door with a slow finality that underscored his absolute authority to initiate events. His attire was informal. His gaze swept the occupants before locking with the subjects. During this brief mutual assessment, the subject's own fortitude was restored. His expression registered not fear, but a severe, unyielding resolve. His subsequent vocalization was directed to the entire assembly. "The subject of this assembly is not commerce, logistics, or finance," he pronounced, his voice a frequency that compelled total attention. "It concerns the systemic integrity of our family and a single agent who has been methodically corrupting it from within." Ettere's posture shifted to one of triumphant vindication, his expression certain he was about to witness my dismissal. He incorrectly surmised Rawl was severing our ties, that his mother's influence had prevailed. It was a profound miscalculation. For the last 1.5 years, Rawl continued, his tone clinically level. Ettore Monte Carlo has accrued unauthorized debt under this family's name. He leveraged our port for unsanctioned deals that circumvented this body. He diverted profits from 3 separate ventures before Sorrow could audit the accounts, and his personal conduct has compromised our reputation. A total cessation of sound engulfed the space. The captains, previously inanimate, were now rigid with alertness. Donna Lucizia's jaw slackened, then audibly snapped shut. Sorrow opened a file and distributed materials, which, by the captain's reactions, corroborated Rawls' every claim. Color drained from Ettore's face. "That is false," he uttered, his voice hollow and weak. "This is a vendetta. Your motive is her." Rawls' expression remained a neutral mask. "The evidence is before you. The figures are present. The dates are present, as are your signatures. Direct your arguments to the documents, not to me." Sorrow executed a brief, sharp nod with the finality of a blade. As the captains processed the pages, their impassivity hardened into unconcealed scorn. At length, Donna Lucitia rose. "Rahl," she began, her voice brittle and strange. "He is your kin." Rahl's gaze met his mother's directly. His expression was not cruel, but it lacked any trace of mercy. It was the face of a man who had already determined the outcome. "You are shielding the son you favor," he said. "I am protecting the family I command. These duties are not congruent." The declaration struck Donna Lucitia with physical force. A word formed on her lips but never emerged. She fell back into her seat, overcome by silence. That quiet from a perpetually vocal woman was the most condemning evidence of all. Ettere's head darted from side to side, desperately scanning for one sympathetic face, a potential ally in the bulwark of loyalty Rahl had constructed. He found none. The captains averted their eyes. Sorrow was already closing his case file. The matter concluded. Bastiano, no longer static, shifted his stance, forming a barrier between Ettore and the exit. He anticipated flight. "You are exiled," Rahl declared, each word a percussive strike of judgment. "From Palermo, this family, and all Monte Carlo interests. From this moment, you are nothing to me." Ettore launched from his chair, his knuckles white, his stare a distillation of pure hatred for Rahl. Then, his eyes found me. I stood in the corner, attempting to merge with the shadows, but as Ettore's furious gaze locked onto mine, I held my position. I met his stare with the same cool, neutral expression from the terrace 3 days ago, when he had attempted to use me as a tactical piece. "This is not concluded," he hissed, his eyes fixed on me. His voice was low and strained, yet it resonated through the floor. It was more than rage. It was a foundational vow, the kind a subject like Ettore adopts when all he has left is a motive to persist. He turned and departed without a backward glance. Bastiano moved, and the heavy door latched shut with a sharp report. The room began to clear. The captains departed first in silence, their postures conveying the weight of the night's proceedings. Sorrow collected his documents, gave Rahl a curt nod, and left with the unhurried gait of an operative certain of his position. Donna Lucitia was last. She stood, gave her son one inscrutable look, and was gone. Bastiano followed, securing the door once more, and then 2 remained. Rahl stayed at the table's head, his hands on its surface, his frame slumping just enough to reveal the true cost of his victory. I moved away from the wall and approached him, my steps echoing in the vast silence. "Was I the catalyst for all this?" I asked, halting opposite him. He lifted his head. His eyes held their typical fire, but were now laced with exhaustion and something new, a raw, fragile vulnerability. "This action was necessary," he said, "but it would not have been executed tonight were it not for you." The unfiltered truth of this admission bypassed my emotional defenses in a way no physical contact ever had. This was the core of Rello Montecarvo, a man who speaks the truth when it is most costly, who never tempers reality. I rounded the table and stood before him, close enough to perceive his body heat and the unique scent of old paper and coffee that defined him. I raised my hand to his face, my fingers tracing the firm line of his jaw, the skin's warmth, the texture of his 5 o'clock shadow. He closed his eyes. In that single reflex, Rello Montecarvo accepting my touch without condition, I understood it was the most vulnerable he had ever allowed himself to be with anyone, more exposed than in the library, more honest than any words he might speak. His eyes remained closed, a quiet surrender in that room filled with history. We relocated to the garden later, to the specific stone bench where our dynamic first became complex. The evening was serene, with the lights of Palermo scattered on the hills like fallen stars. The air held the scent of salt and orange blossoms. Raoul sat beside me, silent, but it was a different silence from the tense quiet of the past 2 days. It was the calm that exists between two people who have ceased resisting a powerful current. I rested my head on his shoulder and he stayed motionless. There was no embrace, no word, no gesture of reassurance. He was merely present, a constant as fixed as the villa's ancient stone. I closed my eyes, absorbing his solid presence and the Sicilian air. We were still. A quiet truce had been reached. The conflict had ceased. Ettore was gone. The family knew the truth. In a situation I had entered seeking only retribution, I had found something authentic. But as a chill came in off the water, Ettere's parting words returned not as memory, but as a cold certainty. He had used only 4 words. His gaze locked on mine as he left, with the quiet menace of a man who does not need volume to create terror. This is not finished. For the first time, I felt a chilling conviction that he was correct. Here, the first volume concludes, though the second is documented. It is available to you now. Just 3 months of quiet was my only desire. Raoul beside me, Ettore removed. The villa was peaceful until a late-night call shattered the calm. On the line was my sister, the one individual I truly value, crying with a desperation I had never before heard. Before I could respond, a man's voice intervened. It was cold, clinical, and terrifyingly familiar. You are aware of my terms, Hortensia, and you understand the consequences of refusal. He did not reappear with rage. He returned with a precise strategy, Russian operatives, and my sister as his leverage. The price for her life was the one vow I would never break. To go back to him, which meant betraying Raoul. As you understand, this is a prelude to Volume 2. To access the complete, uncensored chronicle, you need only use the first link in the pinned comment. I will be there. As a reminder, that initial link provides you with the entirety of Book 2 without advertisements. It is that simple. I am deriving great satisfaction from producing Book 2. And judging by your engagement, I can confirm the narrative only proceeds into deeper psychological territory from here. This is our entry into cases with far more severe stakes, a true dark romance. Because this next section is far more visceral, it would be restricted on this platform. This private venue is where I can be wholly unrestrained and create my best work for you. Recall, the channel's monetization was revoked. This is how I sustain my team and continue providing these high-quality case studies. More updates are coming. I will look for you at the first link in the pinned comment. Regrettably, individuals have been pirating our audio and re-uploading the complete story here.
Here is the emotional sucker punch of the whole story. Nobody actually wins the moment revenge succeeds. Ettore loses his pride, obviously. Publicly exposed, morally bankrupt, finally confronted. But Hortensia does not walk away from the explosion feeling victorious either. Why? Because revenge is a terrible translator of pain. It can communicate fury, it cannot communicate grief. And if grief is the real wound, then revenge is always speaking the wrong language. And then there is Rel. This man looks like the final boss of emotional unavailability. Stone face, controlled voice, shoulders carrying half the underworld. But the deeper irony is that he is probably the loneliest person in the room. Everyone fears him, depends on him, uses him, obeys him. Very few actually see him. So when Hortensia enters his orbit, with her intelligence, her hurt, her refusal to bow, the story stops being about seduction and starts being about recognition. That is why it hurts. She was supposed to be a message. She became a meaning. Pause there, because that is the lesson most people miss in stories like this. The real tragedy is not betrayal alone. It is misdirected love. Hortensia gave loyalty to the wrong man. Rel gave duty to the wrong system. Donna Lucrezia gave her life to a house that taught women to survive by becoming stone. Everybody is paying rent to a structure that does not love them back. So what remains? Choice. Painful, expensive, dangerous choice. Hortensia has to decide whether she wants to be right or free. Rel has to decide whether power is worth emotional starvation. Even the audience is forced to confront something uncomfortable. Sometimes closure does not look clean. Sometimes the wound stays open while the person finally gets honest. And honesty is the final life lesson. Not honesty for morality points, honesty for survival. The moment a person stops romanticizing the wrong love, stops justifying the wrong loyalty, stops performing strength for people who never protected them, the whole plot changes. Maybe not immediately, maybe not safely, but truth is still the first crack in every prison wall.